don't remember some.
Okay.
So Laurie, why don't we start out and just say your name and your date of birth.
My name is Laurie Kathleen Josephine, sometimes McCaffrey, Adams. My date of birth is 12/10/1942.
And where were you born?
I was born in St. Joe's Hospital in Omaha, Nebraska. The old St. Joe's down on 10th Street, which is mostly torn down except for the mental health unit and the nursing home, I think, that are on that property now.
And what were your parents' names?
My dad's name was Robert Kenneth Adams. They called him Bob. And my mom's name was Kathleen Lenore Claire McCaffrey Adams. And she was known as Kay. So they were known as Bob and Kay Adams.
Okay. And how many siblings do you have?
I'm the oldest of 6. Michael is a year younger than me, and he's currently teaching at a college in Salem, Oregon. And I have a sister named Allison, who we friendlily call Al. When she was a little girl, we called her Sunny, but I like Al. And Al, I'm very, very close to. She's my only sister. And then I have a brother named Steve, who works as a maintenance person at Boys Town. I have a brother named Chris. And Chris works in Goodyear. Well, he works, I think, in Phoenix, Arizona, but he lives in Goodyear, Arizona, with his wife, Denise. And then I have a brother named Steve, or Stephen. And Steve, I think I mentioned already Steve. I did. I'm sorry. I'm a little bit senile these days. The next brother would be Jim. Jim is my 4th brother, and Jim works for Cox. He's a producer of videos that do commercials for Cox Cable, and he's very good at it. And that would be all 6. Michael, Allison, Steve, Chris, and Jim. Yeah.
So could you describe a little bit of your childhood growing up in Omaha?
Well, the first memory I have is of living in a house on 50th and Nicholas. And it was a white house, and it was situated about 3/4 of the way down the block, on the south side of the block. And next door to us were the Maxwells, Mr. and Mrs. Maxwell, and their son, who it turned out was a bit of a peeping Tom and an exhibitionist.
Goodness.
But I didn't know those things. What I remember about the Maxwells was that every Christmas they would invite the neighbor kids, each family separately, to make gingerbread men. And also in the fall we would make cran apple jelly with her. And it was quite an interesting neighborhood. When I was very young, during the Second World War, the Japanese sent over balloons, and one of them blew up in the sky in our neighborhood.
Huh.
And every neighbor was sworn to secrecy because they didn't want the Japanese to know how far their balloons had gotten into the States. One of the exciting times when I was growing up is there was a bull snake that became visible to us kids up next to Junior Pepper's house and Mrs. Hanson, which was on the north side of the block on the upper end of the street. And the bull snake was quite exciting to all the neighborhood kids. We were about 4, 5, 6-year-olds. And they called the police. The policemen came out and shot the snake, which of course they wouldn't do today, but in those days that's what they did. Well, we were enthralled with the whole thing. It was a story up and down the block between the neighborhood kids for quite some time. And I believe Junior Pepper buried it in his backyard. And Mrs. Hanson was notorious in the neighborhood because she taught us all how to bake bread. And each of us made bread for our families. Across the street from Junior Pepper was the Slutskys. And the Slutskys had 2 children. They had Beth, I believe, or Susan, and Jerry. I think Jerry Slutsky was his name. Or Bobby Slutsky. Bobby and Susan Slutsky. And the Peppers and the Slutskys were the 2 Jewish families on the block, which I found very interesting. And I only learned when I was grown that they felt slighted by some of the neighbors. They were treated differently because they were Jewish. But in my family, anything different was fascinating. And we were very jealous of Junior because in his home they celebrated Christmas and Hanukkah. So not only did they have Christmas presents, but they had Hanukkah presents for 8 days or 12 days. And I found them fascinating too because on Saturdays, Junior and his brother and his father, and Bobby and his father put on their yarmulkes, I don't know how you pronounce it, but they're little hats, skull caps that they wore when they went to service on Saturday. And they walked to service, which was way over on 50th in California, 50th and what was that street? Not Dodge, but the street on next to Dodge, which would have been, I can't remember right now. But since then, the synagogue has been sold, and they've moved out west. Well, it was always very fascinating to me. Very fascinating. I like the differences in neighbors.
So you have any stories you could tell on your sister or brothers?
Well, let's see. I remember that Al got her finger cut and almost cut off in the clothes chute. We lived on 5019, and then we moved to 5020 or something like that in Nicholas. We moved next door. And in the house next door, there was a clothes chute. And my brother accidentally slammed it on my sister's finger. Or she might have slammed it on her own. I don't really know. And I remember my parents getting dressed, and there was a lot of blood. And they wrapped her finger and ran off to the hospital with her. I think they had somebody, a neighbor or Mrs. Nissen, our babysitter, somebody come over to watch us while they went to the hospital to see if they could get her finger reattached, the top of her finger. And they did. They came home and they were just sick to their stomachs over the whole thing. So they immediately put us all in our PJs and put us in bed, and they went to bed. Now this was in the morning. No breakfast, no lunch, no dinner. They were totally wiped out. My poor sister and my poor brother. But, you know, we've considered it all very interesting and exciting times. I remember one time in that house, the second house we had on Nicholas, that at Easter time, when my sister was about 1 or 2 years old, and she was in the playpen in the living room, and it was just after Easter, and my mother had the grass from the Easter baskets all in a pile in the living room, and I thought it would be fun to light it and see what happened. Started a fire. Burned the Persian rug, burned a chair, burned a lamp. My mother comes in and puts it out, and she says, "Laurie, did you start that fire?" And I said, "No, Mom, it was Al." She couldn't get me to admit it, so she put me up in the room. I was in my room for several days because I would not admit the truth. I don't know if I finally did or my mother surrendered, but poor Al, she got blamed for a lot of things she didn't do.
What are little sisters for?
Well, I loved my little sister, but there was a time when I was very jealous of her because she was beautiful and she was talented. But you know, she earned everything she got, and I will be eternally grateful to her. She's a wonderful, wonderful sister. I couldn't ask for a better sister. And my brothers, each one of them was very interesting. Jim was, he got teased forever about stealing Mother's strainer when he didn't know where the heck it was. But whenever we wanted to tease him, we'd go, "Where did you put Mommy's strainer?" Jim is very creative with film and video and any kind of technical thing. He's very gifted at. Chris didn't speak till he was about 5. Part of that was hearing problems, and part of that was because of some kind of physical disability that they cleared up as he grew older. But he had to be tutored to speak and to pronounce things correctly because he just couldn't hear until they took out his tonsils and his adenoids. He couldn't hear properly. And so for a while they told my parents that he was retarded and all kinds of different things, but my mother and dad stuck to it, and it turned out that he was very bright. He was particularly gifted with, he would have been a great architect. He loved measurements, and he loved spreadsheets and all kinds of things like that. He's just a very gifted guy. And a good daddy, and a good person. Just a very good person. Steve had a wonderful friend named Stephen. I can't remember his last name, but they were very good friends. And he died when he was like 21 of cancer. It was pretty sad. And he was very good friends with him. And shortly after that, Steve got peritonitis through his appendix. He had his appendix blew, and from there he got peritonitis, and he was allergic to penicillin, so they had to give him other things, and he was uncertain whether he was going to live or not, but he survived. And after that time, he had kind of a religious experience where he really came to have a new appreciation of God. And similar can be said of my brother Jim. I don't recall exactly what turned him, but they both had very deep spiritual experience, and it changed their lives forever. Jim was kind of a drug addict, and Steve was kind of an alcoholic, I think, in their early days, but they found God, and it changed their lives forever. And they're very dear to God's heart, I'm sure. And Michael was a world traveler. He would find a way to live cheaply, and sometimes he stayed in jails just so he wouldn't have to rent a place. And he traveled all over the world. And he finally when he got older, he wanted to pursue a degree, and in Syracuse, New York, he went into the university there and got a degree. And during that time, he met his wife, Marjorie, and they fell in love. And Marjorie had helped Father Durand, who was a congressman, write his autobiography, while she was dating Michael, and I think even into the time in which they were married. And he later, he worked for computer companies. He worked for Hewlett-Packard. He worked for Digital Computer, and I think one other computer company. During that time, he worked in England. He worked in Canada. He worked in Switzerland. He worked in Holland, I believe, and Belgium. And eventually he worked in China, Beijing, China. And then he moved to Australia, and he built a house there. And finally he moved to Carmel, California several years ago, and now he's just taken a job at a college in Salem, Oregon. So my family